Hey guys, it's the Melblade5, and welcome to my response to Totally Not Mark's Pokemon The Devolving Designs video, featuring Tom O'Regan. So like almost every video I respond to, I don't go watch them with the intention of responding and disagreeing with them, and this is probably the most apparent case of that, as there's a bit of a weird story behind how I came to watch this video. So before Sun and Moon came out, I discovered that at least a noticeable portion of the Pokemon fanbase shared a strong dislike for Pokemon with complex designs.
What we really don't want is just a bunch more complicated Pokemon designs.
Which was a view I always had a hard time understanding, as while I can understand why someone would prefer more simplistic designs, I found it difficult to get why someone would say complex designs from a visual standpoint are bad, as I personally felt that they generally looked cooler and more interesting. And the fact that those people never explained the reasoning behind their opinion didn't help. Upon discovering this video, I watched it in the hopes of learning why Pokemon having complex designs was a major point of contention to some fans. And the video did kinda help me understand that, but from these circumstances you can tell that there were some things I disagree with in this video. Not the opinions themselves, and I don't think that this is a bad video, but rather that I think that there were some aspects of the designing stage of Pokemon that weren't taken into consideration. Now, this is the only Totally Not Mark video I've seen, so I don't have anything against him. The same applies to Tom, although I don't know how much influence he had on the video script, if at all, which is why I'm excluding him from the title. I also checked the comments of the video and found that he did leave a comment acknowledging some of the mistakes in the video, as well as saying he regrets how he presented the topic. This has been taken into consideration when presenting my arguments. Lastly is that I'm not an expert on character design, nor will I try to act like one. I at least know more than commentators though. So when I talk solely about design, it's purely subjective.
However, an aspect that's bothered me more and more as time passed by has been the direction in which these Pokemon designs have gone in. So, before I got ahead of myself, I decided to ask my followers on Twitter to participate in a poll. The question I asked: what generation of Pokemon had the best designs? With the options being Gens 1 and 2, Gens 3 and 4, Gens 5 and 6, or Gens 7 and 8. These were the results.
So with the Twitter poll, you did cover this in your pinned comment, where you did cover how the majority voted for Gen 3 and 4, but you focused on Gen 1, that it was unnecessary with this video purely being your opinion, and explained that you had to group the generations together because of Twitter's limit on poll options. With these being acknowledged, the only issue I have with this part worth mentioning is that you included Gen 8 in the poll, when at the time of your video, and this video, the only Gen 8 Pokemon we know about are the starters. I think it's unfair to judge the whole generation off of just 3 Pokemon right now. Therefore, I think it would have been better if you didn't include Gen 8 in the poll, which would have slightly alleviated the issue of having to group the generations in pairs. So skipping over the rest of the general intro and most of the explanation for why the Pokemon designs have changed over the years, because there isn't anything for me to comment on there.
Ken Sugimori was one of the 2 founding members of Game Freak alongside series creator and my fucking boy Satoshi Tajiri.
I know this is an off-topic and pretty minor error in the grand scheme of things, but that isn't Satoshi Tajiri. That's Tsunekazu Ishihara, the president of the Pokemon Company. I'm not trying to single you out on this, as I have seen quite a few people make that same mistake, mainly because Google image searches for Tajiri also return Ishihara for some reason. But here is Satoshi Tajiri. Now on to actually important stuff.
If you look closely at his early designs, he really liked to implement tough-looking features to his characters. The fur is distinctly jagged, the claws are pronounced, and the texture conveyed with the watercolors is gorgeous.
I'm a bit confused as to why you used Pikachu for the example of Ken Sugimori's Gen 1 Pokemon designs, because Ken Sugimori didn't design Pikachu. Pikachu was created and designed by Atsuko Nishida, who you talk about a little later on as Pikachu's creator. I don't know if this is a mistake on the editor's part, or somebody just forgot, but I find it pretty weird when you could have used one of the Pokemon that you previously said he created as the example instead. You also mentioned things like tough-looking features when Pikachu is on screen. Again, this could be a result of whoever chose to use Pikachu as the example making a mistake, but personally, I wouldn't consider Pikachu as tough-looking. I don't know any Pokemon that Sugimori designed myself, but I have heard that he apparently did Gyarados, and if that's true, I think that would have been the perfect example to convey one of his tough-looking designs. After this part, there's a lot of explaining the behind-the-scenes process of designing Gen 1, which I'm obviously skipping because it's just giving facts and I don't have anything to say in regards to that.
What's interesting is that when the games were being localized for a Western release, they actually changed some of the sprites to make them look less like the unfortunate result of a sex crime. Sprite work was tough back in the day because the Game Boy could only display a whopping total of 4 pixels at any given moment. The designs, colours and poses had to be kept pretty basic if you wanted them to be recognisable, and even then they were pushing their luck sometimes.
This is a part of the design process of Pokemon that I think gets brushed to the side in this video when considering how the designs changed with each generation. Gen 1's designs were influenced by hardware limitations, but with the later generations, they eventually had more powerful hardware, which meant they could create more detailed sprites and later 3D models. Obviously, this gave the designers more creative freedom when making new Pokemon, which resulted in the generally more complex designs seen later, as well as the more cutesy, toy-like designs you talk about later. Personally, I think it's better if a designer had fewer restrictions with what they could make as reasonably possible, so as not to limit their ability, which is part of the reason why I usually prefer a lot of the later Pokemon visually compared to Gen 1, but that's just me. Even then, the later generation still had its fair share of simplistic designs, some of which I like on par with the more complex ones. Something I feel doesn't really get acknowledged in this video if I'm being honest.
The original 151 were designed with these kinds of hardware limitations in mind. Sugimori said, "The Game Boy didn't have colour. That's why we made the colouring something that could be easily expressed in black and white."
It's precisely for reasons like this that Charmander was given a spike in his back and Pikachu was given stripes there too, to help break up the colour scheme so that when the back sprites were shown in the games, they were easier to recognise with the limitations of the old game's sprite art. However, the red and green illustrations for sprites weren't the only ones given to Generation 1. No. Enter red and blue. The various artists dedicated to sprite and illustration could diverge and explore more interesting posings independently, which led to better sprite art overall and much better illustrations.
I think this part of the video could have been expressed a bit better if you compared the Gen 1 sprites and poses to the later generations. That way I think you could better explain why Pokemon past Gen 2 don't do this very well. Because, admittedly, I'm having a hard time picturing a large enough proportion of Pokemon from Gen 3 to 5 that don't have one of those two design points you talked about. I can see a bunch of those Pokemon having features that would distinguish them if they were in the old games, and or having dynamic poses with their in-game sprites. 6 and onwards is a bit different when it comes to the poses, since they mostly stay in a normal standing position and get more dynamic with their idle and battle animations, so I can understand your point on that part.
Why do I think these designs were so great? They emphasized that these were creatures, wild animals that you can venture out into the wilderness to find. These revised designs for red and blue looked as though they were sketches of wild creatures from a biologist's journal. They aren't posing for the camera for the most part, they are either attacking it in a defensive position or looking off elsewhere. Character creatures, not toy adverts. Pocket monsters, not pocket toys.
I get where you're coming from here, but I think this is something else that doesn't really get acknowledged for the later generations, as I think when it comes to the Pokemon from those generations that are based on real-life animals, they can still convey the feel of them being like actual animals in that world, even with the overall art style, albeit there are some exceptions. The only part about Gen 1 feeling like creatures rather than toys that I'm a bit confused on is in relation to Pokemon that are based on inanimate objects like Magnemite, or humanoid ones like Machamp. That's something I think you could have addressed. As for posing, I do agree with you on that, even if I prefer the more battle-ready poses from later on.
Because of the success that cute Pokemon like Pikachu had found, Game Freak's design team decided to double down on that angle. As the series went on, things like sharp teeth, fur, claws, and overall edge took a backseat in favour of more rounder, friendly, cute and soft designs.
I wouldn't really say that the edgier designs took a backseat. If anything, I'd say that they created more of a balance between intimidating and cute Pokemon. After Gen 2, we got Pokemon like Salamence, Garchomp, Crocodile, Bisharp, Tyrantrum, and Golisopod to name a few. Personally, I wouldn't call any of them cute. I mean, just look at Haxorus. It has an axe for a face!
And on top of that, despite having the biggest teams working on the designs to date, Generation 6 and 7 produced the least amount of new Pokemon to the series. That said, I would imagine there needed to be more artists for the later games as they shifted into the 3D space. However, once the anime found success and Pikachu took the world by storm, I personally think that the design team decided to hedge their bets on the cute factor more and more as time went on. And so, the somewhat realistic, more creature-based design theory was thrown out in favor of softer, rounder, more cartoonish design principles.
I don't necessarily think that Pikachu was solely responsible for the shift towards cuter designs, because Pikachu's design isn't viewed as just being cute. It's more seen as a blend between cute and cool, the latter of which likely playing a big part in Pikachu's popularity. This relates to how in the anime, Ash's partner was originally supposed to be Clefairy, but was changed to Pikachu so that it could appeal to both boys and girls. Clefairy's design is something I would far more describe as just being cute, which girls would generally get more appeal from. Pikachu bringing a cool factor into it helped to create appeal for boys as well, and once again generalizing here, boys would probably get a lot of appeal from the more badass designs as well. Skipping past the part talking about the polls on whose Pokemon was their favorite, because I completely agree with the conclusion that cuter isn't always better.
Let's start with who I think is the biggest victim and example of the new design philosophy, Scorbunny. Now, believe me, I thought this would be a simple enterprise. I would just take elements from the original designs and substitute it into the new Scorbunny design. So that's what I did originally. I made a list of design elements from Generation 1 I thought might fit with the design, but the more I did this, the more I realized I had to change the character entirely. I couldn't keep his face as flat as it appeared, I couldn't use the cheek puffs, I couldn't even use the ears. And trust me, I tried as many different ideas and posings as possible, and none of it worked. So at that point, I decided to take a step back and start from scratch, and study some real rabbits, which ultimately led me to this design. I decided that this was the right direction to go in and built upon that, trying out tons of different designs, asking friends their opinions, ultimately finishing with this. My Generation 1 Scorbunny design.
With your Scorbunny redesign, I think it's really good, so don't take this as me hating on it. But if there was something I had to criticize about it, it would be that it loses a lot of its origin. What I mean by that is Scorbunny isn't just based on a rabbit. At the time of this video, we haven't seen the evolutions for the Gen 8 starters, so this could be subject to change, but right now, it's commonly believed that Scorbunny may also be based on a footballer, or soccer player if you're American. Visually, this is reflected in its bipedal movement and the bandage on its nose, but in your redesign, Scorbunny is now quadrupedal, although that could be just how you chose to pose it, and the bandage looks a little less pronounced to me, so the footballer aspect is almost non-existent. Granted, that would be hard to convey with the old design philosophy, but that's where a problem with that philosophy arises. The making Pokemon look like actual animals works well when the Pokemon in question is solely based on an animal, but if it's a Pokemon based on a mythical creature, something that was very uncommon in Gen 1, or an animal of a secondary origin, for example, it doesn't work as well in my view. I would also be curious to see how you would redesign other Pokemon that are based on rabbits, like Buneary and Bunnelby, because you could prove this next argument wrong. But another issue I think the old design philosophy suffers from is that it could be hard to distinguish Pokemon that are based on the same animal if they are all made to look like that actual animal. While the designs became less realistic looking, I think it ultimately helped to create more variety between Pokemon. For example, Caterpie and Wurmple are both based on caterpillars, but they look completely different from one another so you can easily tell them apart. Even Pokemon that are based on a similar type of animal are given enough distinguishing features so you can separate them. Again, this argument could easily be proven wrong depending on how people may design those Pokemon with the old philosophy, but I thought it was worth discussing. So that's everything I really need to say about this video, as from that point, it's simply the conclusion, and I didn't have any gripes with the Grookey and Sobble redesign since, as you said, they didn't diverge as much from the old philosophy as Scorbunny. Like I said before, I don't think this is a bad video, nor am I trying to say your opinion is wrong or anything, because I have some very unpopular opinions on Pokemon that wouldn't give me a right to say that. I just think that some aspects of the old design philosophy, the later generations' designs, and how the overall design approach changed, weren't taken into consideration when making this video. Things that I think would have helped to further push your arguments about how you feel the designs devolved, and opened up more of a discussion. But this is coming from someone who started with Gen 4, so maybe my mind is being poisoned by being more familiar with the hip youngins designs. With you regretting how this video was presented, I hope this doesn't come across as mean-spirited. I just felt like expressing some of the personal gripes I had with the video. Anyway, with that, I'll see you guys for my next response video. Again, whatever that may be.